Matt Lewis.
Matt Lewis.
Matt Lewis.
Matt Lewis.
Matt Lewis with the Daily Beast. He's their senior columnist.
Friend of mine and friend of America.
All right, everybody, welcome to the podcast. Thank you for rating and reviewing on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play, wherever you consume podcasts. And please, it's a special time of year. If you want to support this kind of long-form podcast, this conversations that we have in the new year, go to patreon.com/Matt Lewis. And if you do that, if everyone listening were to do that right now, we would probably have about a tenth as much Patreon support as my guest today, Katie Herzog. And she is the co-host of the very good Blocked and Reported podcast. Katie Herzog, welcome back to the news.
Hey, Matt. Thanks for having me.
Always great to talk with you. I want to start with you. You filled in for Andrew Sullivan recently on his newsletter, right? So Andrew Sullivan's one of the people who left his perch at a mainstream media outlet and is now on Substack, and he took a week off. You wrote about it. You wrote in his place, "Where have all the lesbians gone? Where have they gone?"
They have moved to the suburbs with their wives. No, the piece was about a phenomenon that I've been observing over the past decade, which is that people who would formerly have been known as lesbians or as homosexual women are transitioning. They're either transitioning to men or they are calling themselves non-binary or queer. So there has been, like, using various sort of changes in terminology, there has been this sort of vast decrease in the number of people, specifically young people, who call themselves lesbians and are sort of out and proud women, at the same time that there's been a rise in the number of people who call themselves queer or non-binary or trans or something like that. And there hasn't been any sort of good comprehensive studies on this, so what I'm observing is anecdotal. But from the response that I got from the piece, I have seen that this is something that lots and lots of people are also observing.
I mean, at some point it could just be like a matter of semantics, right? Like, we used to call them progressives, and then they kind of ruined their name, and FDR started saying liberals, right? And then about 10 years ago, liberal became a bad word, and they started becoming progressives again. Like, is there anything behind it? Is it just a name change, or is it a lifestyle change?
I think it's both. So it's important to note that non-binary and trans are not the same thing. And there's a lot of debate about what both of those things mean. And some trans people are non-binary and some non-binary people are trans. But like, I think the way of simplifying it, to me, I look at it this, like, a trans person is somebody who experiences gender dysphoria, which is a clinical diagnosis, and then takes steps to change their body to be in line with this internal sense of who they are. You know, someone who's born male and wants to appear to the world to be female. To me, that is what a trans person is. And like, lots of trans people would argue that that's not actually what it is, that there's like various other definitions. But I think that that's the one that like makes the most sense. And so that's what I'm sticking with. Non-binary is people who say that they are neither male nor female. They are neither men nor women. And I've talked to a lot of people. I have a lot of friends who call themselves non-binary. And when I ask them, so what does it mean? What does it mean to be not, you don't feel like a man or you don't feel like a woman, or you feel somewhere in between? What I get is always the same answer, which is this reversion to stereotypes. So I'll say, what does it mean to be non-binary? And my friend says, well, it means that sometimes I feel like a man and sometimes I feel like a woman. Okay, well, the obvious next question is, what does it feel like to be a man, or what does it feel like to be a woman? That's when the reversion to stereotype happens. So then they say, sometimes I want to like dress masculine and sometimes I want to dress feminine. And to me, that's troubling, because what that says is the idea that non-binary exists is dependent on the fact that there's a binary that exists in the first place, which I don't really believe. Everybody has some masculine elements inside of them and some feminine elements inside of them. And if you say that makes you somehow outside the normal population, what you're saying is that these gender roles and stereotypes are intractable. So that's what sort of bothers me about this. I think that instead of saying, I'm a woman and I reject gender stereotypes, what the non-binary identity says is I reject gender stereotypes and therefore I'm not a woman. So I do find this troubling. I think that what's going on is a trend. I think that this is just incredibly trendy. I think there's a social contagion. I think for some people, it probably is a way of dealing with elements of dysphoria or a genuine attempt to dismantle these sort of gender roles. But I think for a lot of people, they're just looking around at what their friends are doing and they're doing the exact same thing.
And at some point, like defending lesbians becomes a conservative thing, right? Because in the good old days, we had lesbian bars, but apparently they're closing down, right?
Right, and there are lots of different reasons for that, COVID being one. But there were in the 80s, there were apparently over 200 lesbian bars in the country, and at this point, there are less than 15. And part of that is economics. It's difficult to run a bar that caters to a narrow slice of the population. Part of that is the gentrification of cities, and cities are really expensive, so lots of lesbian bars have closed. But this other, I think, more interesting thing that's happened is that the term lesbian has become to some people, it seems exclusionary, and maybe it is exclusionary. If I say I'm a lesbian, what I'm saying is I am excluding half of the population from my romantic interests, the same way that being straight is exclusionary or whatever. But so by this sort of contemporary, like this new queer ideology, the only sort of morally justifiable sexual identification is pansexual, which means you're attracted to every sex and gender on the map. And so what has happened is that in cities like Portland and Seattle and San Francisco and places like that, when you have a lesbian bar or let's say a dance night that's specific to lesbians, there is oftentimes this internal drama over inclusion. And so a lot of these places, you might want to have a dance night for women who are attracted to women, but you wouldn't call it that. You would say like, this is open to queer, trans, non-binary people people actually avoid the term lesbian. Part of it is because it's just not cool anymore. But part of it is because there's this angst over the term because it is somehow exclusionary. I will point out, you never see this infighting over gay male spaces. It doesn't happen. In terms of women's spaces, it happens all the time. You can have like in Seattle, there's a not like a spa, but there's a bathhouse for women. And a couple of years ago, there was all this conflict because trans women wanted to be included in women. Well, these trans women in particular had penises, and some women objected to that. You do not see that at the gay male bathhouse. Nobody is getting fights over the inclusion of vaginas. Why is that? I have some theories.
It's a really interesting piece, and you write not long ago it would have been the Christian right stigmatizing homosexual women. Today, it's also from people who call themselves queer. This is obviously a piece you put a lot of time into. You quote, several different people with really interesting perspectives. How much time did you put in to writing this, and like how much is reporting versus, like an opinion essay?
I put a lot of time into this piece, and the published version is pretty short. It's about 1,500 words, and part of that was, so this is for Andrew Sullivan's Substack newsletter, and there are some sort of technical parameters, like if your newsletter, your Substack is too long, it has problems. Google has problems sort of, I guess, like migrating all of the text. So it was cut down from like a 4,500 word piece that was a lot more nuanced and a lot more detailed and got a lot more people's voices into the abbreviated version that was published. And so what you see is not the entirety of the work that I put into it. I worked on this for like 2 weeks solid and didn't work on anything else, which is a lot for me.
Where can people read the full version?
They can read it on my Patreon. That's the I'll send it to you, Matt. But we put it on the Patreon. I don't know if I don't think it'll ever get published anywhere, but I do sort of want people who are interested to read it. So if you want to become a patron, there it is posted there.
How do they become a patron?
It's patreon.com/blockedandreported.
Blocked and reported. Cool. So who did you interview that like had the most interesting or surprising perspective?
So I interviewed a woman named Liza Cowan whose work you might actually know. So do you know that there's that famous photo that went viral? The photo was taken in the 70s, but it went viral a couple years ago. And it's this photo of a woman sort of leaning against a house, and she's wearing a t-shirt that says "The future is female."
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, so this is Liza Cowan.
I definitely remember "The future is female" slogan becoming controversial.
Right. So that was initially, this was a t-shirt. This was a slogan made for a t-shirt called, or a lesbian bookstore in the 1970s in Greenwich Village called Labrys Books. And there were like 10 of these t-shirts made that just said the future is female. And on the back, it had the Labrys Books logo. And Liza Cowan, a woman who's now in her 70s and lives in Vermont, took this photo of her then girlfriend, Alex Dobkin, wearing this photo. A few years ago, some Instagram account, feminist Instagram account came across the photo online, posted it on their Instagram feed, and then it became this meme. And then of course, somebody commodified it and made a new version of the t-shirt. So you can buy these t-shirts off of Amazon or Etsy or from various other retailers. Oftentimes they're, probably made in China by young slaves. And so Liza Cowan has very mixed feelings about this shirt. But so I had a really long conversation with her. And it was really fascinating because she was around in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s when the whole goal of lesbian activism was to expand the definition of what a woman was. So she told me, if a woman is wearing pants and driving a truck, that doesn't make her a man. That makes her a woman wearing pants and driving a truck. I think that's progress. I think that that's how I want to live my life. I want to expand the definition of what it is to be a man and what it is to be a woman. I think that people should be defying gender roles. Gender roles, some of them, I'm not a blank slatist. I do think some of them, have roots in basic human biology and psychology. But I think that as evolved beings, we can dismantle these gender roles, and oftentimes that'll be a good thing. To give people more freedom, right? But what we're seeing now in this sort of contemporary queer ideology is really the opposite of that. So it was really interesting to talk to a woman who has been around and to get her opinion on what's happening. And she's deeply troubled by it. There's this, we have this generation of young gay and lesbian and queer and bisexual and pansexual women who don't want to be women anymore. And I think we should talk about that. But of course, when you do talk about it, you get called transphobic or a TERF. And
we're going to get to that, and we're going to get to that in a minute because I learned what that was an hour ago.
Yeah. So that was really interesting. I also talked to a woman who's a therapist working with LGBTQ populations, and she told me that the majority of her clients who come in who are young, say under 25, who come in to see her, a population that would be I can't believe I have to sort of mince my words here, but people who would have been called lesbians a generation ago, natal females who are exclusively same-sex attracted. What they come in complaining about is gender identity. And she said that this never happens with her older patients. Her older patients might come in complaining about relationships or sexuality or something like that, but they don't, gender identity is just not a problem that they have. And until really recently, gender identity was only a problem that deeply dysphoric people had, right? So this term was coined in the 1960s by a psychologist, and it was sort of a fringe concept until really the last decade. And now all of a sudden, this idea has emerged that we all have a gender identity inside of us. And this is something intractable and meaningful and deeply personal, like the soul. And just speaking with her and saying realizing okay, this is only something that young people are dealing with I'm generalizing here, but in her experience, this is something that her young clients deal with, something that her older clients don't. It's we have created this problem, and created it, I think, in a way that really is to the detriment of lots of people. It does help some people that this has become mainstream. It's not like transgender people have existed for quite a long time. I believe that they should have support and access to medical care and, human rights, of course. I don't think they should be forced to use the bathroom at their birth sex, and I don't think the state should be legislating that in the first place. But I also think that we have sort of the media and pop culture, we have sort of created a problem for people that just didn't exist even a generation ago. And I find that very interesting.
It is. And so I want to hear about the email, right? So how do you know Andrew Sullivan? How did you get tapped to do this? And what kind of response did you get?
So Andrew's editor, Chris Bodner, he asked me to do it. I've met Andrew once in person, but we're sort of friendly. We sort of exist in the same heterodox ecosystem. And then his editor, Chris, who was his editor at The Dish, reached out to me and asked me to do it. And the response was like shockingly positive. And I say that because I've written about trans issues before. Specifically, I wrote a piece on detransition in 2017 that had just a really, really negative response, which I'm sure I've talked about it on your show before. But to give people the short version, I got basically canceled. People were burning.
And yet here you are.
And yet here I am.
It's amazing.
Here I am. Amazing. And so the response this time was very different. It was almost 100% positive. I think Andrew got one sort of dissenting message, and everybody else was supportive. I had the same experience, except I had 100% positive messages, which really rarely happens. And I think the main reason for that was that this was published on a Substack on Andrew's newsletter. So it was paywalled. You could see it if you had the link, which I had like the free link, so I passed it around online. But if you just like went to Andrew's newsletter, his Substack, you wouldn't have been able to see it, and it wasn't published in a mainstream publication.
Yeah, so it's like people are self-selecting.
Exactly.
If they're reading this, they're predisposed to like Andrew Sullivan, and He is heterodox, as you said.
Right.
And Andrew's been on the show, and I have to say I like Andrew, and he's been on the show, and it's funny, we had lunch a couple years ago, and I remember the whole lunch, everything he was saying, I just totally agreed with. And I'm like, dude, I have to just be honest with you and admit that, like, I'm just so surprised that, like, the world has changed to such a degree that where, like, we are completely simpatico. And I said, I have to admit, like, a few years ago when you had this trig trutherism thing, I thought you were, crazy and evil. And, and I thought, like, literally that was the end of the conversation. I thought we were going to get up and leave. And he proceeded to go on for at least an hour about how Trig really was Sarah Palin's daughter or something like that. I don't want to misrepresent it. Maybe he didn't say 100%, but he's still pretty convinced. And the conversation did continue for a lot longer than I thought it would.
Andrew is such a smart man that I don't know much about the Trig trutherism, but if somebody like Andrew really believes something like that, it would make me pause and take a second look at it. But again, Andrew and you both have religious beliefs that I think are totally ridiculous. So I guess I have my limits there.
So, well, I want to talk about the other, controversy that you've been tweeting about. And this is not something you wrote. It's something that was written in The Atlantic. And again, I said, you mentioned the term terps, which I didn't know what it meant. But why don't you clue us in, those of us who are just sort of out here, sticking to our 1950s values. What are terps and what is this latest controversy in The Atlantic?
Okay, so the term TERF is an acronym or an initialism for trans exclusionary radical feminist. And so what that means is somebody who, it has really expanded. So initially what the term meant was somebody who would say, like, I'm a lesbian and I don't want trans women in my spaces or something like that. The thing is, it's like the term Nazi or fascist, like it gets thrown around at everybody. So if you question something like pediatric transition, or you think like, well, I don't really think that, 12-year-olds are able to give informed consent about things like puberty blockers or taking hormones, then you are going to be called a TERF. So you can, so basically, like most like mainstream Americans would be considered TERFs by the like increasingly, broad definition of the term.
But the F is for feminist, right? So I mean, right. It's traitor to your class kind of thing,
right? And the thing is, though, it's a derogatory term. People do not use almost nobody has like reclaimed this term and uses it to apply to themselves. This is a derogatory term. It is used primarily to shut down the conversation. Calling somebody a TERF is like calling them a Nazi. There's like stickers around Seattle calling me a TERF. I'm not trans exclusionary. I'm not radical, nor am I a feminist even. So I don't know, I guess that's the point, is like, you don't have to fit any category and people will still call you a TERF. It's just a way of like attempting to silence people, and primarily women, Interesting.
All right. So what was this Atlantic piece? What were they arguing?
So this piece was published in the Atlantic yesterday. It was by a writer named Caitlin Tiffany, who I believe is a staff writer, and it was called the Secret Internet of TERFs. That was the second headline. The initial headline that they published was something about like all those groups Reddit banned for hate speech are still around. So they were calling this group of women, or they were calling this group of women, like they're calling it a hate group, which is ridiculous. And so it was not a profile, but it was a very bizarre piece about how this group was banned from Reddit. The subreddit was called Gender Critical. So Gender Critical is the preferred term that some feminists, some of them are radical feminists, use to describe this political position. And the position is basically that sex exists and gender doesn't. So I know that seems like kind of confusing if you don't spend a lot of time marinating in these spaces, but the difference between sex and gender, and oftentimes, like, there's also lots of debate about this. Some people say that sex and gender are interchangeable. So sex is a biological reality that is connected to chromosomes, organs, and like the size of gametes, right? We know what sex is. That's biology. And gender is the sort of the social construct that is imposed upon people based on their sex. So gender roles. So gender is essentially a shorthand for gender roles. And so what gender critical feminists want to do is have like sex-based protections and dismantle the concept of gender. And so what?
So this is having your cake and eat it too.
Well, it's not. It's the opposite of what trans ideology is. So trans ideology is that gender, the way that you feel about yourself, is important. That this is a material reality. Your gender identity. Matt feels like a man. Katie feels like a woman. That the way that you feel is somehow like incredibly meaningful. Your biology is not meaningful. Does this make any sense?
Well, no, and I mean, I agree with the notion that, like, I think a lot of who we are is hardwired.
I do, yeah.
I do, right? So, like, my little boys, like, they do not want to, like, turn sticks into M16s because they saw it on TV.
Right.
Like, there's something deeper, and if you have kids, you're gonna notice it.
Right.
By the same token, I do think that there is some of this is cultural. I think a lot less, but there's some degree of it that's cultural.
Right. And
like men used to wear robes.
Absolutely.
And now they don't.
Absolutely.
Right.
Yeah. Pink used to be a masculine color. And you can see this in terms of, like, so there's this new HBO documentary called Transhood. And they follow these like 4 or 5 kids as they're over 5 years. And you have these young kids, toddlers, essentially, male toddlers, who like to wear pink and like to wear dresses. And, oftentimes they have older sisters, right? And so kids want to parrot the things around them. And so instead of saying, like, oh, this is a little boy who likes to wear purple and has a tutu and doesn't realize that that's a boy thing or a girl thing, just likes it. What some of this contemporary trans ideology would say is that's not a boy, that's a girl. So that's, and you can, like, there have been lots and lots of research on trans kids over the past 30, 40 years. And what they found is that this is mostly research coming from gender identity clinics in Scandinavia. And what they found is that the vast majority of children who show up at these gender identity clinics complaining of just dysphoria, or their parents have brought them in because it's a little boy who likes to dress like a girl or whatever, the vast majority of them, something between like 60 and 80%, end up what is called desisting, which is reverting their gender identity revert to their birth sex. And the majority of them end up growing up to be gays and lesbians. It should also not shock anybody who has spent time around gays and lesbians that oftentimes it is abundantly clear from a young age that there is something different about these kids. I was a tomboy. Not to say that all tomboys are going to grow up to be lesbians. That's obviously not true. But, you do have the effeminate boy who wants to hang out with girls and is into ballet, and he grows up to be a gay man, and people aren't generally surprised about that. But so this contemporary ideology is, no, he's not a gay man or she's not a tom girl. They're trans.
Yeah.
Right.
So this piece, I mean, I saw like Christina Hoff Sommers, criticizing it, or is this just, kind of a one-off, or no, is this like part of a larger trend?
This is part of, so the problem with the piece, there's lots of problems with the piece. The biggest problem with the piece is that the basic premise is wrong. The basic premise, like the author completely, she got wrong what she would call TERF ideology. She she screwed up the definition of what these people actually believe. Like she clearly wasn't listening to them. She said that they want to, what was it? She said that what gender critical feminists want is they want sex protections. They want to dismantle the concept of gender. And what she said is that the opposite of that. They ended up doing a correction in the piece. But so there was like mistakes like that, but also she spent a lot of time talking about these like weird technical issues, like who designed which Reddit and which Reddit was this. It's boring. There's like, instead of spending paragraphs talking about what these people actually believe, she wrote about these boring technical information that nobody in their right mind would care about. But one of the subjects of the piece, this woman, Mary Kay Fang, she posted all of her correspondence with the author of this piece. And it's really interesting. The author asked her about like these, do you think that this ideology is hate speech? And she gives this like long explanation for that. None of this was included in the actual piece. The piece was just incredibly biased. Her trans sources are incredibly biased. She uses two main sources, one of whom is Caitlin Burns, who is a writer for Vox, who was fired from her previous job for libel. At least I think I'm getting that correct. I probably shouldn't say that because maybe that's
if not, we could be libeling.
Yes, we could be libeling
right now.
But she is a woman who I am 100% sure has committed libel because she libeled the co-host of my podcast.
Oh, there you go.
As he extensively documented.
Problem solved.
Right. So the other one is a professor at Berkeley called Grace Lavery, who recently was in the news because Grace advocated for burning Abigail Schreier's book on trans kids. And the author of this piece doesn't mention that at all. So this is a piece that's supposed to be about like free speech and censorship and quote unquote terps, and she doesn't mention that her two main sources here, one of them has committed libel and the other one advocated for book burning, and then said she was kidding about the book burning, but like if you read her entire thread, she's defending book burning the entire time. So it's like incredibly bad. It's not just biased, it's as though she went into this with utter contempt for her subjects, for these women she was writing about. I mean, the fact that they use the term TERF in the headline kind of tells you all that you need to know, because TERF, a lot of people consider TERF a slur, and the Atlantic published it in a headline. So I think that tells you about where their brains are on this issue.
And this is a staff writer there, is it correct? Like this is not like a guest, one time thing.
Yeah, this is a staffer. Another thing that's interesting about this, she sort of goes out of her way to find the worst examples of, some of these radical feminists and gender critical feminists are, I think, very unkind to trans women. They do things like, not all of them, but some of them do things like misgender them. That's nothing, I would never do that. I find it unkind and also counterproductive. And they're on their, like, it's the internet. They can be sort of snarky and mean. But what they don't do is advocate for violence. And even on this Reddit, the subreddit, the gender critical subreddit was banned. The moderators were very controlling about, like, they were very clear there would be no violence on this subreddit. And you never see gender critical feminists advocating for violence against anybody. You don't see it. That is not true on the other side. If you go to turfisaslur.com, you can see collections of people threatening women with violence. And in fact, a 60-year-old woman was punched in the face outside of some sort of protest in England a couple years ago by a trans woman because of her views. And so this author of this piece, Caitlin Tiffany, doesn't at all explain that at all. And in fact, she goes out of her way to find the most sort of egregious cases of these women engaging what she calls hate speech, and they're really not that egregious. I mean, it's like in the the long course of the internet, we're talking like low misdemeanor level stuff here, like calling someone a creature and saying like a trans woman is a man in lipstick, like not kind, not something I would say, but hate speech, no.
All right. Well, if Caitlin Tiffany doesn't like this and she wants to come on the podcast, she's welcome to do so. Katie Herzog, how can people? Well, first of all, before we wrap up, you mentioned your co-host Jesse. He has a book coming out.
Yeah.
Is this available for pre-order? How do we get this?
It is available for pre-order. The book is called The Quick Fix: Why Fad Psychology Can't Cure Our Social Ills, I believe. And I haven't read it, but I think it sounds really interesting. It's about this sort of TED Talk style viral psychological interventions like the implicit associations test or the concept of grit or power posing, things like that, why they spread in society despite having lots of flaws and oftentimes.
So this is like the self-help book to end all self-help books.
Yeah, exactly. So it comes out in April. It's available for pre-order. Jesse, his last name is Jesse Single. If you Google him, he's easy to find. He's everywhere on the internet.
Definitely. I want to get him on to talk about it when it comes out.
Yeah.
And how can people listen to the podcast, follow you, all that good stuff?
I'm on Twitter at Kitty Herzog. The podcast is blocked and reported. It's available wherever you find your podcast. We have lots of extra content, including the longer version of my piece for Andrew's newsletter at Patreon. That's patreon.com/blocked and reported. We're iTunes, Spotify, all that stuff.
Awesome. And then it's Cutie on Twitter, right now.
That's right. I suppose that joke has sort of faded from the discourse now, but yes, a reference to the viral blockbuster Netflix hit Cuties.
Yeah, well, that's where it comes from. Okay,
right.
I get it. And then some people from my church are protesting Netflix over that. Apparently,
yeah.
So, and then you can actually find her on Twitter at Kitty Herzog. You do not make it easy for people to find you on. I mean, like literally. Yeah. If you were looking for Katie Herzog, it would be impossible to find.
Just Google me. You'll find it. Ask someone. Yeah.
Awesome. Katie Herzog, thank you for coming back on the news.
Yeah, it's great to talk to you.
If you like this podcast, rate and review it on iTunes. Follow Matt on Twitter at Matt K. Lewis. Thank you for listening to Matt Lewis and the News.